There is a specific kind of quiet that happens right before something important. Not silence exactly, but a compression of sound, like the world is holding its breath. That kind of quiet settled over the room in Los Angeles in the summer of 1967 when two of the most formidable men alive stood facing each other on a training mat, and only one of them knew what was about to happen. On one side stood Steve McQueen. At that moment, Steve McQueen was quite possibly the most famous human being in American cinema. Bullitt wasn't out yet, but The Great Escape had already made him a legend. The Thomas Crown Affair was on its way. He was pulling in enormous salaries that would eventually make him the highest-paid actor on the planet. Women wanted him. Directors feared him. Studios bent to his demands. When Steve McQueen walked onto a movie set, people adjusted their posture. When he smiled, photographers captured it. When he spoke, people wrote it down. He was called the King of Cool not because someone invented the phrase, but because no other phrase fit. This was a man who raced motorcycles professionally under a fake name, Harvey Mushman, so his film contracts wouldn't interfere. A man who did his own stunts, who had pulled 5 drowning Marines out of Arctic water during a training exercise. A man who had clawed his way out of poverty and reformed schools and a stretch with street gangs to become an icon that America genuinely believed it had invented. On the other side stood Bruce Lee. And in the summer of 1967, if you didn't know who Bruce Lee was, you were not alone. The Green Hornet had just been cancelled. The show had run one season of 26 episodes, and while Asian audiences adored Lee's portrayal of Kato, Hollywood saw him as a supporting player, a novelty in a superhero sidekick role. He was earning private lesson fees of around $150 an hour, which was considerable money but nothing compared to what McQueen commanded per film. Lee was envious of McQueen's status. By several accounts, he made no secret of it. He genuinely wanted everything McQueen had: the mansion, the car fleet, the Hollywood power. He was openly competitive about eventually surpassing him. And yet in this training space, with the floor mats worn slightly at the edges and the light falling across the room in that particular Los Angeles afternoon way, something switched. McQueen brought his famous cool into the room. Lee brought something else entirely. Not ego. Not performance. Just presence, a particular kind of presence that belongs to someone who has spent years learning the difference between what looks powerful and what actually is. This is the story of what happened between them in those sessions. And more importantly, it is the story of what Steve McQueen did after Bruce Lee stopped the sparring mid-round, the thing almost no one talks about. Because the moment Lee raised his hand and called stop was not the moment the lesson ended. It was the moment the real one began. Part 2. Steve McQueen, the man inside the myth. You cannot fully understand what happened in those sparring sessions without understanding who Steve McQueen actually was beneath the image. And the image was extraordinarily well constructed. Terrence Stephen McQueen was born on March 24, 1930, in Beech Grove, Indiana, to a mother who struggled with alcoholism and a father who was a stunt pilot and who abandoned the family when Steve was 6 months old. He never knew him. His mother was young and overwhelmed, and by the time Steve was 3, he was living with his maternal grandparents in Slater, Missouri. His great-uncle Claude was a steady, strong presence, and McQueen credited him later with being one of the only reliable male figures of his early life. But that stability did not last. When Steve was 8, his mother remarried and brought him back to live with her and his stepfather, the man who, according to multiple biographers, was abusive. McQueen ran. He ran into the streets, into a gang called the Dirty Dozen in Los Angeles, into reform school, into the Marines, into small-time grifting, and odd jobs that included, by his own admission, working as a pimp and serving as a getaway driver for robbers. He had a 9th-grade education. He was partially deaf from a childhood ear infection. He was dyslexic. And then, somehow, through sheer stubbornness and a raw explosive charisma that no acting school could manufacture, he became Steve McQueen. His biographer Marshall Terrell, who wrote multiple books on McQueen's life, described him as the embodiment of yin and yang, the simultaneously sweet and terrifying, caring and profoundly selfish, cocky, and secretly insecure. Reviews of Mark Elliott's biography described a man who was fueled by pain, pride, and an insatiable hunger for control. The phrase that keeps appearing in accounts of McQueen's professional life is that it was always his way or no way. He counted Paul Newman's lines in scripts to make sure he didn't have more. He walked off The Sundance Kid because he could not get top billing over Newman. He was combative with directors, abusive at times to people close to him, and compulsively competitive in every arena, not just movies, but racing, fitness, relationships, everything. What made this particularly interesting is that the competitiveness was not born from confidence. It was born from the opposite. A man who grows up invisible, abandoned, reformed, and written off does not stop needing to prove himself just because he becomes famous. He proves himself louder. He builds a fortress of cool around the wound and calls it a personality. He becomes the king of cool partly because cool is the emotional opposite of what he actually feels, which is exposed and afraid and always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Steve McQueen worked out religiously at 2 hours every day, almost without exception, for his entire adult life. Not because he enjoyed it, but because his body was his shield and his proof. He boxed. He lifted weights. He took up martial arts in the late 1960s not as a hobby but as an extension of the identity he had built and was constantly fortifying. And when he was introduced to Bruce Lee through their mutual friend Jay Sebring, the celebrity hairstylist who had also been present when Lee first demonstrated his skill at the 1964 Long Beach Karate Championships, McQueen saw not just a martial arts instructor but a man who might give him something no amount of racing trophies could provide. The question was whether he could receive it. Part 3. Bruce Lee's Hollywood Underground. To understand what Bruce Lee was offering in those sessions, you have to understand what Bruce Lee himself was in 1967. He was not yet the global icon. He had not yet made Enter the Dragon. He had not made The Big Boss or Fist of Fury. He was 26 years old, operating in a strange, in-between space of famous enough in Hollywood circles to command significant private lesson fees, but not yet the movie star he desperately wanted to be. After the Green Hornet was cancelled, Lee found himself with a strategy. He would charge premium rates for private instruction, reportedly starting at $150 per hour, which was deliberately high. His advisor on the project, the producer Charles Fitzsimmons, told him the high price was necessary to establish exclusivity. The logic worked. Lee began building a circle of students that reads like a Hollywood directory. James Coburn, James Garner, Lee Marvin, Roman Polanski, Sterling Siliphant, Sharon Tate, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He was eventually charging $150 per hour and more. But Lee was not teaching Hollywood its own tricks in new packaging. He was teaching something genuinely different. What he called Jeet Kune Do, translated from Cantonese as the way of the intercepting fist, was not a style in the conventional martial arts sense. It was almost the anti-style. Lee's foundational principle was what he called using no way as way. He drew from Wing Chun, from Western boxing, from fencing, from philosophy of Eastern and Western, ancient and modern. He read voraciously. He was absorbed by Jiddu Krishnamurti's ideas about freedom from psychological conditioning and by the Taoist concept of wu-wei, or effortless action. His library at home contained works spanning centuries and disciplines, and his famous Tao of Jeet Kune Do, compiled from his notes, is as much a philosophical text as a martial arts manual. What this meant practically is that when Lee trained someone, he wasn't running them through choreographed sequences or drills to be memorized. He was exposing them to their own habits. He was creating conditions in which their conditioning revealed itself of the places where ego overrode instinct, where fear masqueraded as aggression, where identity got in the way of movement. Lee himself said of his celebrity students that what they were really seeking was not self-defense but a way to express themselves through movement. He saw his role as helping people express the human body honestly. This was a sophisticated and genuinely uncommon approach. And it was also, for someone like Steve McQueen, potentially devastating. Because McQueen's control was built on performance. His body was the tool of his myth. To have someone reading your body like an open book, or someone whose eyes track not just your footwork, but your psychology, was not training. It was a different kind of exposure entirely. Lee's approach with every student began with a simple diagnostic. He did not run beginners through kicks and punches. He watched them. He let them move, let them initiate, and read their story in the way they distributed weight, in the timing of their exhales, in the micro-expressions that preceded a strike. Dan Inosanto, one of Lee's closest associates and a third-generation instructor in JKD, later described in the 2013 documentary I Am Bruce Lee what Lee told him about McQueen and his other top student James Coburn. That he wanted McQueen to be more like Coburn philosophically, and Coburn more like McQueen as a fighter. McQueen had the toughness. He had the will. What he didn't have was the willingness to be empty. Part 4. How Steve found Bruce and what he was really looking for. The first training session between Bruce Lee and Steve McQueen took place on August 25, 1967, at McQueen's home. This is documented fact, recorded on the Bruce Lee timeline maintained by researchers who have pored over Lee's detailed personal records. McQueen had been introduced to Lee through Jay Sebring, the hairstylist who connected more of Hollywood's elite than any agent or manager. Sebring was a karate student himself, had been present at Lee's famous 1964 Long Beach demonstration, and had seen enough to know that Lee was something different. McQueen was not in the habit of trusting people easily. His biographer Marshall Terrell noted he was too paranoid to make friends quickly, that his suspicion of people, rooted deep in a childhood where adults consistently abandoned or hurt him, made forming real bonds difficult. The friendship with Lee had to grow out of the training relationship, not the other way around. McQueen spent time with Lee at first simply because he believed Lee could teach him something. The trust came later, built session by session. But what was McQueen actually looking for? The surface answer is physical fitness. McQueen worked out 2 hours a day, and he wanted to be in peak condition for his race driving, for the stunt work he insisted on doing himself in his films, for the simple maintenance of the body as brand that his career depended on. But there is another layer. Steve McQueen was never satisfied with performing toughness. He wanted to inhabit it. He did his own stunts not because it was cheaper or practical, but because it was necessary for him psychologically. He needed to feel real. Every interview, where he sat calmly in expensive sunglasses and gave monosyllabic answers, was a performance. Every motorcycle race he entered under a fake name was something closer to honest. He was looking for the version of himself that didn't need an audience, and martial arts, real martial arts, not choreographed stage combat, offered that possibility. When Lee's name started circulating in the law, fitness, and martial arts communities, the whisper attached to it was always the same. Bruce Lee breaks the ego. That sentence would have been either instantly repellent or magnetic to someone like McQueen, depending on whether the ego was listening or the person underneath was. McQueen came anyway. That choice alone tells you something. What Lee saw when McQueen first walked in, according to everything we know about how Lee read people, was a man armored at every joint. The cool was not relaxation. It was tension organized so precisely it resembled ease. McQueen was carrying something heavy and calling it composure. Lee didn't waste time on small talk. He understood, as someone who had spent years reading bodies rather than words, that conversation was where the mask got comfortable. He skipped straight to the movement. And the movement would say everything. Part 5. The first exchange, reading the body. The early stages of any sparring session with Bruce Lee worked as a kind of interview. He would give a student space, invite them to move, and then simply observe. Not react, not counter, observe. This was itself a psychological move, because for dominant people, being observed without response is maddening. The ego wants engagement. It wants the opponent to flinch, react, acknowledge. Lee gave nothing back at first but stillness and attention. McQueen's natural fighting style was hard, direct, and muscular. He had been boxing since he was a young actor in New York, drawn to it for the same reason he was drawn to racing. It was honest, it was physical, it left no room for pretense. His movements when he struck were deliberate statements. They said, "Here is the force I am capable of." They were readable in exactly the way Lee described as the fundamental problem with ego-driven movement. The ego broadcasts before it acts. It sends telegrams in the set of the shoulders, the forward lean of weight, the slight narrowing of focus that precedes a real attempt. Lee's entire philosophy of combat was built around intercepting that telegraph. Jeet Kune Do literally means the way of the intercepting fist, the idea that you don't wait for the attack and then block it. You read the intention before the motion is complete, and you act on the intention. This requires a level of presence that most people never develop because most people are too preoccupied with managing their own performance to notice someone else's. When McQueen threw his first real combination, Lee did something that reportedly made a deep impression. He didn't block. He simply wasn't where the punch was going. A half step, almost invisible, a shift in angle so slight it looked like nothing, and McQueen's fist passed through empty air. This is deeply unsettling for a fighter who is used to making contact. The absence of resistance means there is nothing to gauge against. You cannot measure your own force if there is nothing to push back. McQueen went again, faster. Lee was not there either. He moved in the way water moves around an obstacle, not by opposing it, but by changing shape. His footwork was economical to the point of seeming lazy. His shoulders stayed loose. His face was neutral. Lee described his own mental state during sparring as a kind of total clarity, not the absence of thought but the absence of self-consciousness, the state Zen Buddhism calls mushin, or no mind. He was not thinking about winning. He was not thinking about how he looked. He was simply reading the moment as it arrived and responding to it without delay or decoration. For someone like McQueen, watching that for the first time was probably infuriating in a way he couldn't fully articulate. He was being outmaneuvered by someone who appeared to be doing almost nothing. There was no drama in Lee's movement, no visible effort, none of the grunting exertion that McQueen associated with genuine physical contest. It looked casual. It felt devastating. And then Lee touched him lightly, precisely, almost gently. Not a strike intended to hurt. A message. I was here. McQueen escalated. That escalation was itself data. Lee later told writer M. Yehara that McQueen would train for hours without stopping, pushing through pain and fatigue in a way Lee genuinely admired. McQueen's toughness was real. But toughness is not the same as clarity. Toughness is force. Clarity is efficiency. And in those first exchanges, Lee was demonstrating that efficiency doesn't just beat force, it makes force irrelevant. Part 6. The stop and what happened in the silence after here is the moment the story pivots on. And the reason it matters is not what Bruce Lee said when he raised his hand and called stop. It is what happened in Steve McQueen's body in the seconds that followed. It happened after McQueen had been escalating, pressing harder, faster, with more weight behind each movement. Lee had been reading every escalation, stepping around it, tagging back with light touches that were less strikes than annotations. And then McQueen's movement shifted from competitive to something raw. The punches became personal. There was frustration in them now, something underneath the technique that was no longer about sparring at all. It was about proving, about refusing to be the one who doesn't understand. Lee raised his hand. He stopped the session in a flat, final way, not harshly, but absolutely. And in the silence that followed, McQueen's breathing was the loudest thing in the room. What McQueen did next is what no one focuses on, because it's not cinematic. He didn't storm out. He didn't throw a punch at the wall. He didn't use the biting sarcasm that people who knew him described as his default defense mechanism. He stopped. He stood still in the middle of that floor. And he asked, with something in his voice that was not quite a challenge and not quite a question, that was something between the two, what he was doing wrong. That question is enormous. Because for a man with McQueen's armor, asking what you're doing wrong is functionally the same as acknowledging that you might not be right. And for someone whose entire architecture is built around the premise that he is always the one who is most right about himself, about what he can do, what he should do, how he should be perceived, that crack in the armor is the whole lesson. Everything else Lee could teach him about footwork or timing or angle was technique. The willingness to ask that question was the door. Lee's answer, according to the pattern of how he taught everyone who trained with him, was not about technique. It was about the thing driving the technique. He had watched McQueen try to win, not try to learn, to try to win. And these are different operations running on different software. Trying to learn keeps the nervous system open. Trying to win closes it around the objective of protecting status. When the nervous system is closed, it cannot receive new information. It can only repeat what it already knows, faster and harder. And an opponent who isn't interested in matching your existing patterns simply walks around them every time. What Lee told McQueen in various ways across their training sessions, and this is documented in how he described McQueen to writer M. Yehara, and how Dan Inosanta relayed Lee's observations, was that McQueen's greatest limitation was also his greatest strength. He was ferociously persistent. He literally would not stop. But not stopping and actually progressing are not the same thing if what you're not stopping is the ego's agenda. McQueen was running the same program with more intensity. Lee was asking him to change the program. The silence after Lee stopped the sparring was where that message landed. Not in the words. In the space between them where McQueen had nothing to perform for. Part 7. Bruce Lee's method of taking apart the armor to appreciate what Lee was actually doing with McQueen across their sessions. It helps to understand something fundamental about how Lee saw the relationship between ego and movement. For Lee, ego was not a psychological concept, it was a physical liability. A fighter whose movements are driven by the need to protect image is a predictable fighter, because image requires consistency. You cannot defend a reputation and remain fluid at the same time. The reputation demands certain behavior. Fluidity demands that you abandon expectations. Lee used to tell his students the Zen story about the overflowing cup. A learned man comes to a Zen master to inquire about enlightenment. As they talk, the man keeps interrupting with his own opinions and knowledge. The master eventually begins pouring tea into the man's cup and keeps pouring after it is full, letting it overflow. The cup is already full, the master says. Like this cup, you are full of your own opinions and speculations. How can I show you anything unless you first empty your cup? This was Li's entry point with every new student. He was not trying to add information to an already full cup. He was trying to help them identify that the cup existed. With McQueen, the cup was the identity of the king of cool. It was the muscle memory of command, the practiced ease, the absolute conviction that in any physical confrontation, McQueen would be the one in control. Li later said he admired McQueen's toughness in a way he admired few people's, that McQueen genuinely did not know the meaning of quitting. But he also made clear that quitting was not McQueen's problem. His problem was that he couldn't let himself not know in the moment, because not knowing looked like losing, and losing looked like the facade cracking. Li's training method exposed this systematically. He would give McQueen space, then cut the angle. He would let McQueen close the distance, then redirect. He would leave what appeared to be an opening, and watch what McQueen did with it. Every time McQueen jumped at the opening, Li wasn't there. Every time McQueen escalated force in response to being read, Li didn't match the force, he evaded it, making the force meaningless. And every time McQueen thought he had figured out the pattern, Li changed it. Broken rhythm is one of the central concepts in Jeet Kune Do, a deliberate disruption of timing so the opponent's anticipatory mind cannot settle into a groove. What this produced in McQueen was the thing that athletic training rarely produces in very competitive people. Genuine uncertainty. Not the uncertainty of someone who doesn't know how to fight. The uncertainty of someone who suddenly can't use what they know as a reliable source of identity. When the tool you have been using to define yourself stops working, you are briefly stripped of the definition. For most people, that is terrifying. For Bruce Lee, it was the most honest moment in any training session. It was the moment where something real could actually happen. The stops mid-round were part of this architecture. Lee stopped sparring when McQueen crossed from competitive to ego-driven, not to punish him, but to mark the moment. To say this. Right here. This is the thing. Not the technique or the energy behind the technique. The energy that is trying to win rather than move. When Lee raised his hand, it was a mirror, not a wall. Part 8. The war inside McQueen. What was really at stake? Everything about the public record of Steve McQueen's life points to the same pattern. He was a man in constant negotiation between the version of himself that needed to prove something and the version that was exhausted by the proving. The racing was honest. The stunts were honest. The moments on film that people still respond to decades later, the quiet looks, the way he could say an entire paragraph with a glance, those were honest. But the controlling, the paranoia, the compulsive competitiveness, the insistence on being the biggest name on every poster, that was the armor talking. McQueen's childhood had installed a conviction in him that he could not afford to let people see him uncertain. Uncertainty in the homes he grew up in was dangerous. It meant you got sent away. It meant the person who was supposed to protect you left. The solution his developing mind found was to become the hardest, fastest, most unmistakably capable person in any room, but to make himself too valuable to lose. This was the origin of the cool, and also of the obsession with control. His biographer described the biography's main thesis simply. It was his way or no way. Now imagine this man in a room where the rules are someone else's. Where his way doesn't work. Where everything he has spent decades calibrating as a signal of competence, of the controlled aggression, the physical directness. The absolute refusal to back down is not just ignored but effortlessly bypassed by someone who appears to be doing almost nothing. And not just bypassed in front of an audience. In private. In a training space with no cameras and no crew. Where the only witness to his inadequacy is the person who keeps stepping around his best efforts with what amounts to calm inconvenience. That is not just a martial arts lesson. That is a reckoning. Because the part of McQueen that kept being thwarted was not his body. His body was genuinely impressive. Bruce Lee said explicitly and on record that McQueen was one of his two best celebrity students as a fighter, that he had a toughness in him that was rare. What was getting thwarted was the program running underneath the body. The need to win that had been operating like background software since childhood, managing every situation, preventing every genuine moment of not knowing. Lee saw this with the clarity that came from years of learning to read people through their movement rather than their words. He told Uehara something that functions as the heart of the whole story. He wanted McQueen to be a little more like Coburn philosophically. James Coburn, Lee's other most celebrated celebrity student, had a different relationship with learning. Coburn was interested in the ideas. He was drawn to the philosophical dimensions of Jeet Kune Do and absorbed them with something close to delight. McQueen wanted the fighting without the emptying. Lee was telling Uehara, in his affectionate way, that the fighting and the emptying were the same thing. Part 9. The gloves come off. At the last round revealed the training relationship between Bruce Lee and Steve McQueen continued from August 1967 onward, with the frequency varying depending on McQueen's filming schedule. Lee told Uehara that McQueen would disappear for months at a time on location, in the desert racing, somewhere that wasn't a training floor, and then return. When McQueen was filming The Rivers in Carrollton, Mississippi in October of 1968, he actually flew Lee out to the location to serve as his personal trainer. That detail is significant. McQueen, who was already one of the most powerful men in Hollywood, spent his own money to bring his teacher to him rather than simply train without him. That is not the behavior of a man who is indifferent to the lessons. Lee noted that McQueen would train for hours straight without stopping, punching, and kicking until he was completely exhausted. One documented story has McQueen cutting his toe badly during an outdoor training session, badly enough that skin was hanging and blood was flowing freely, and refusing to stop. Lee told him to stop. McQueen kept going. That stubbornness, that physical relentlessness, was the authentic version of the thing that showed up as ego in the sparring context. It was real grit. The problem was that in the sparring circle, grit without openness is just repetition with more force. The sessions that got deep were the ones where McQueen ran out of force to apply. When Lee had moved around every burst of intensity, tagged him lightly enough times that escalation had clearly produced nothing, and the competitive fuel ran low, that was when something else became possible. That was when the question changed from "how do I get this guy?" to "what is this guy doing?" And the second question is learning. The first is just war. In those moments, when McQueen was actually watching instead of pressing, Lee would let the teaching become visible. He would demonstrate the wrist release or hold his wrist out, let McQueen grip it hard, and then free himself with a subtle angle and a loosening that made McQueen's grip suddenly purposeless. He would show that softness was not weakness but a different kind of information, that a hard grip told you everything about where the force was going, while a relaxed arm told you nothing and went anywhere. He would demonstrate how holding your breath when you're trying to dominate makes you rigid, which makes you slow, which makes you wrong. And McQueen, who had lived his entire life in the premise that harder was better and force was respect, had to sit with the evidence that a man who weighed 130 pounds and appeared to be doing nothing was consistently more effective than his best effort at full strength. The thing no one talks about is what McQueen reportedly took from those sessions into the rest of his life. Not techniques, not a fighting style, something harder to name and harder to preserve. He started, by accounts of people who worked with him in the late 1960s and early 1970s, to pause in situations where he previously would have bulldozed. Not always. Not completely. The ego doesn't vacate the premises after a few months of training. But there were moments when people noticed them as unusual for McQueen, when he would hold still and wait instead of immediately seizing control. Part 10. What Steve did after. The part history skips most retellings of the Lee-McQueen relationship. Focus on the anecdotes. The terrifying joyride down Mulholland Drive where McQueen scared Lee so badly that Lee ended up on the floor of the car threatening to kill him. The signed photograph McQueen sent Lee to Bruce Lee, one of my favorite fans, after Lee had written to claim he was now the bigger star. The gifts McQueen kept trying to press on Lee. A Porsche, a down payment on a house, which Lee politely refused. These are the fun stories, and they're all documented and real. But what happened inside McQueen after those training sessions was something quieter and harder to find. The record is fragmentary, assembled from what people said about him rather than what he said about himself, because McQueen was not a confessional person. He said about his martial arts practice later in life, "I'm not an expert or anything like that. I'm not involved in the martial arts to any degree. Bruce was just a very old personal friend of mine, and I cared for him a lot. I thought he was a brilliant, fine philosopher about everyday living." That statement is interesting for what it does not say as much as what it does. McQueen doesn't talk about the technique he learned or the fighting ability he developed. He talks about Bruce as a philosopher of everyday living. That framing was not accidental. McQueen was not a man who said things carelessly. He was being honest about what the real value of those sessions was. He continued training after Lee. When Lee became a movie star in Hong Kong and the training sessions naturally tapered off, McQueen moved to Chuck Norris as an instructor. Then to Pat Johnson, a stuntman and stunt coordinator who became one of McQueen's closest friends. He kept the practice going for the rest of his life. And importantly, he kept it private. Biographer Marshall Terrell specifically noted that McQueen never tested for a belt and kept his martial arts practice low-key deliberately, not because he was embarrassed by it, but because he didn't want it used as evidence against him in court if he ever had to defend himself. That is practical thinking that reflects how seriously he took it as a real skill rather than a Hollywood accessory. What training with Lee gave McQueen that no other instructor gave him was the experience of being genuinely read. Of being in a room with someone who was not impressed by his reputation, who was not adjusting their behavior to accommodate his fame, who was not going to go easier on him because he was Steve McQueen. Lee was too ambitious himself, too hungry for his own stardom, too fundamentally confident in his own ability to be intimidated by McQueen's celebrity. He respected McQueen as a fighter. He was not in awe of him as a person. That distinction mattered enormously. McQueen said privately to people who knew him that his respect for Lee was different from his respect for almost anyone else in his life. Lee was one of the very few people McQueen could not manage. He couldn't outcharm him, couldn't outcompete him in the training space, couldn't buy his way out of the lesson being taught. And the experience of being genuinely ungovernable, of encountering someone who simply would not be moved by all the tools McQueen had spent his life sharpening, was one of the most significant things that ever happened to him. The proof of that, documented and undeniable, came on July 30, 1973, in Seattle, Washington. Steve McQueen, who notoriously avoided funerals, who had not attended Sharon Tate's service despite being friends with her for years, flew from Los Angeles to Seattle to be a pallbearer at Bruce Lee's funeral. Lee had died on July 20, 1973, from a cerebral edema caused by a reaction to the painkiller Equagesic. He was 32 years old. There were two funerals for chaotic, overwhelming service in Hong Kong attended by over 15,000 mourners, and a smaller, quieter service in Seattle where Lee was buried at Lakeview Cemetery. McQueen was at the Seattle service. Standing beside James Coburn and members of Lee's family, McQueen helped carry the casket. A photograph captured that moment of Steve McQueen straightening the nameplate on the casket, Coburn behind him. His expression is private in a way that his public face never was. He said, according to biographer Matthew Pauly, "I cared about Bruce. I felt like saying goodbye to a friend. That's why I went up there to pay my respects and to try to make it easier on the people around him." That last phrase is the one worth holding. To try to make it easier on the people around him. Steve McQueen, the man whose life strategy was to make things harder for everyone who challenged his supremacy, showed up to a funeral he didn't want to attend for a man he would never outshine, who had never let him be the most powerful person in the room and make it easier on other people. That is the lesson landing. That is what happened after Bruce Lee stopped the sparring. Not in the next minute. Over years. Quietly, in the private unrecorded decisions that no one documents because they don't make headlines. Part 11. The legacy of two men who needed each other. The relationship between Bruce Lee and Steve McQueen was complicated in ways that make it more interesting, not less. Lee was openly envious of McQueen's Hollywood status. He wanted everything McQueen had and said so. He resented that McQueen refused to star in The Silent Flute, the project Lee was developing with James Coburn and writer Sterling Siliphant, which McQueen turned down because he didn't want to use his fame to make other people stars. That was a real wound, and it left a real mark on their relationship. At the same time, the exchange between them was genuinely mutual. McQueen gave Lee advice on acting. Lee later told Iyehara that McQueen was careful not to try to convert him to any particular style, that he believed each actor had to create his own voice, and that you couldn't learn that from someone else. The training fees between them were reportedly informal at best. Writer M. Iyehara believed Lee never charged McQueen, and McQueen made up the difference in extravagant generosity, the Porsche offer, the house down payment, flying Lee to film locations on his own dollar. Lee reportedly flew into McQueen's sets, and they would spend evenings talking about philosophy and life rather than training. "Steve flies me in because he wants to talk to somebody else besides the same guys he works with all day," Lee told Iyehara. "We usually talk about life or philosophy and work out a little. That is not an instructor-student relationship. That is a friendship, one of the genuinely odd and real ones where both parties get something they couldn't get anywhere else and neither party fully acknowledges how much they need the other. McQueen needed Lee because Lee would not be managed. Lee needed McQueen because McQueen showed him what the most powerful version of success in the world he wanted to enter actually looked like and was honest that the lesson went both ways. When Lee died and became, posthumously, far more famous than McQueen ever predicted, there was probably something both painful and satisfying in that for McQueen. The man who once wrote a letter claiming he was now the bigger star had become, within a year of his death, genuinely indelible. Enter the Dragon hit American theaters in August of 1973. The month after Lee's death. The impact was immediate and lasting. McQueen watched all of that from the outside, from the world Lee had been desperately trying to crack for years. He did not, by any account, begrudge it. He spoke about Lee with consistent warmth and specific respect, not the generic appreciation you offer for the dead, but the particular kind of language people use for people who actually changed something in them. A brilliant, fine philosopher about everyday living. He was very much into finding out who he was. That last sentence is the interesting one. He was very much into finding out who he was. Spoken by a man who spent his entire life performing who he was rather than finding it, about a man who spent his entire life doing the opposite. Part 12. The lesson that outlived both men. Both Bruce Lee and Steve McQueen were gone by 1980. Lee died in 1973, at 32, still racing toward the Hollywood fame he deserved and almost reached. McQueen died on November 7, 1980. At 50, from mesothelioma linked to asbestos exposure. He spent his final years with a quietness that people who knew him described as different from his earlier self, and not the compressed tension of the king of cool, but something more settled. Whether the training years with Lee had any direct connection to that quietness is something no one can say with certainty. What can be said is this. The story of Bruce Lee stopping the sparring mid-round and what Steve McQueen did after is not really a story about martial arts. It is a story about the difficulty of being genuinely taught something. It is about the gap between learning and performing, between training and proving, between presence and image. It is about two men who were both extraordinarily good at their respective versions of those performances and what happened when one of them temporarily ran out of performance to give. Bruce Lee's philosophy, documented in his personal writings, in the Tao of Jeet Kune Do, in interviews and the accounts of his students, comes down to something simple and genuinely hard. The obstacle to growth is not weakness. It is the armor you built to survive the conditions that once threatened you, now deployed in conditions that no longer require it. McQueen's armor was the king of cool. It had served him spectacularly. It had gotten him out of poverty, out of reform school, out of invisibility. It had made him a legend. And in that training room, it was getting him hit. Lightly, precisely, by a man who was barely moving. The lesson Lee kept stopping the sparring to deliver was not about the hit. It was about the gap between what the armor costs you and what it's protecting you from. When you can observe the armor, see it, name it, watch it operating, you are not controlled by it. You can choose whether to deploy it. That choice is the freedom Lee kept pointing toward. Not the freedom from difficulty or competition or physicality. The freedom from automatic response. From running the same program harder when it doesn't work. From mistaking the performance of control for the experience of it. Steve McQueen, who notoriously ran on automatic responses, who deployed the same program of dominance and cool in every situation whether it served him or not, had an experience in those sessions of something different. The experience of being fully read, fully present, and briefly unable to hide. And what he did after was show up for the man who gave him that experience. He showed up to carry him home. That is not the flashiest part of the story. There's no slow-motion kick, no dramatic sparring sequence, no iconic quote delivered while adjusting a collar. It's a man at a funeral, straightening a nameplate on a casket, trying to make it easier on the people around him. But that quiet, private act of care is where you find out who someone actually became. And Bruce Lee, whose whole philosophy was about stripping away performance to find what was real underneath, would probably have recognized it immediately. You can learn the kicks. You can learn the angles. You can master the broken rhythm and the intercepting fist and all the vocabulary of Jeet Kune Do. But the part that matters is the cup. Whether it is empty enough to receive something you couldn't already predict. Steve McQueen walked into those training sessions with a full cup. He walked out, over time, with one that had a crack in it. And sometimes that is the most a teacher can honestly hope for. If this story landed for you, if you found yourself thinking about the armor you wear in your own life, or the moments when you're running a program instead of actually being present, hit like. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. These stories about the people history remembers are most interesting not for their legends, but for their honest moments. And there are more of them coming. Note: the specific details of individual sparring exchanges in this script are reconstructed from known facts about Lee's training philosophy, his documented teaching methods, his stated observations about McQueen, and the established character of both men. The framing of psychological dynamics is interpretive, drawn from biographical accounts by Matthew Pauly, Marshall Terrell, and M. Yehara. All documented quotes and events are clearly grounded in the historical record.